Just yesterday, I was a builder in Kiev, and now I'm the commander of an artillery brigade. Fire! We're fighting for our country, so that scum doesn't come crawling to us. We have our children and our parents here, and we want them to live in peace and tranquility.
While attacking, the Russians fire from tanks. But for every shot, they receive incoming projectiles or get hit by FPV drone strikes. Sometimes Ukrainians use various types of anti-tank missiles. Overall, luck is not on their side. The Ukrainians repel another Russian attack, destroying all Russian tanks and APCs. No tank manages to survive during the attack. They all, without exception, will be destroyed. We've seen dozens of destroyed tanks just in the last week. By the way, this one was burned by an American M67 grenade. Thanks to the American people for the powerful weapon. And now, take a look at the work of these two Ukrainian soldiers. Together, they managed to destroy numerous Russian armored vehicles using FPV drones. Their first capture was a Russian infantry fighting vehicle loaded with ammunition. Great job! Next, they repel the attack of Russian armored vehicles, not allowing them to break through. This Russian APC receives 2 drone strikes. Meanwhile, an artillery anti-infantry projectile explodes nearby. The Russians continue their attack but lose another APC, possibly detonated by a mine. When the Russians began to maneuver, the Ukrainians destroyed the lead tank with an anti-tank missile. Then, 2 kamikaze drones destroyed another armored vehicle. After that, the Russians stopped attacking as they suffered heavy losses. When the attack is halted, the Russians scatter in all directions. After the failed attack, the battlefield is strewn with damaged tanks and APCs. But many tanks and armored vehicles still remain undamaged on the battlefield. Therefore, drone operators are persistently working to destroy all Russian weaponry. And of course, Russian trucks delivering ammunition to the front are also systematically destroyed. This video is evidence of the first case where Russians managed to hit the American HIMARS rocket artillery system. The HIMARS was spotted not far from the front line. To hit the American rocket artillery system, the Russians used a super powerful ballistic missile Iskander. After such a missile, the HIMARS is guaranteed to be destroyed. In 2 years of war, they have only destroyed 1 unit. But the Russians were very happy and consider it a great achievement. Another tank was also destroyed using a shaped charge shell. All ammunition in the tank detonated. Some Russian soldiers, seeing their armored vehicles burning and exploding, try to flee the battlefield at high speed. However, the Ukrainian FPV drone easily catches up with them. In fear, the Russians abandon the APC, forgetting to turn off the engine, but continue running after it. It looks both funny and sad at the same time. When the APC finally stalled, the Ukrainians finished it off. The Ukrainian army has left the city of Avdiivka. For over 4 months, the Russians besieged this city and finally captured it. In the last few days, they dropped hundreds of heavy FAB-500 bombs on the city, making it practically uninhabitable. After the explosion of such a bomb, any building is destroyed to its foundations. The loss of Avdiivka doesn't change anything strategically on the front. It's not even noticeable on the general map. But it took the Russians 4 months to capture the town. During this time, they lost nearly 50,000 people, 1,112 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, and a lot of other equipment. For the Russians, this is a Pyrrhic victory. Putin needed this town at any cost so that he could offer something to the people as a victory before the March elections. Therefore, Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from Avdiivka and will continue to destroy Russian military equipment in open terrain. In conditions of a shortage of artillery ammunition, the Ukrainian army relies more on FPV drones than usual. On some front lines, drones have completely replaced artillery. Fortunately, the Ukrainians are currently successfully holding back the enemy's advance. Taking advantage of the moment, while the US is not supplying ammunition to Ukraine, the Russians attempt to attack even at night. Once again, Ukrainian forces stop them using drones equipped with night vision devices. In the morning, the Ukrainians continue to burn the Russian armored vehicles they destroyed during the night. Sometimes, there are so many tanks and APCs that the battlefield becomes a smoke-filled landfill. Every attack comes at a very high cost for the Russians. Russian soldiers who abandoned their armored vehicles on the battlefield face a survival test. The smart ones try to negotiate with the drones while the foolish ones run away. Ukrainian drones are hunting them down. Some of them hide under the damaged armored vehicles, but Ukrainian drone operators are aware of this and skillfully direct their drones right at the target. It's reminiscent of the Squid Game from the Korean series. Trucks are not harmless transportation and are also subject to destruction. They are an important part of Russian logistics, delivering ammunition to the front line. But there is another danger from the Russians, the so-called roaming tanks or lone tanks. A column of tanks is easy to notice, but a single Russian tank can sometimes sneak very close to a Ukrainian bunker to destroy it. To prevent this, Ukrainians carefully track such tanks from the air and immediately destroy them. In this video, you can see one of the roaming tanks. A Ukrainian drone easily ignited it. The tank burned for a long time, and its fuel spilled onto the ground, but eventually the tank exploded. All that was left of it was just small scattered pieces of metal. This Russian roaming tank, the T-72, was halted during the night. In the morning, the Ukrainians struck it with an FPV drone. One drone proved to be enough to make the tank burn and render it useless. Russians are increasingly employing the tactic of roaming tanks, trying to operate more discreetly.
To the north of Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces also have to hold back the Russian troops' advance. Russians send infantry and tanks. This tank attempted to break through, but got stuck in a trench. Shortly after, it was hit by a Ukrainian drone and exploded a few minutes later. Look at this Russian MLRS, Soltsepek. The crew was tasked with shelling Ukrainian positions, but the Solntsepek was hit by a Ukrainian drone before it could launch its rockets. Now, it's exploding with its ammunition. And Ukrainian soldiers are watching and recording the spectacle. This Russian APC was packed with explosives and sent towards Ukrainian positions to destroy their bunker. However, the Ukrainians destroyed it before it reached its target. This is a common practice among Russian forces, and I've shown you several instances of it before. Here, the Russians also lost numerous tanks. Burning abandoned tanks is a favorite pastime of Ukrainian soldiers. It's like a game. First, you have to accurately drop a grenade into the narrow opening of the tank turret, and then record a video of the tank burning for us to watch. Many young Ukrainian guys who enjoy playing computer games happily work as drone operators, partly because this job offers many spectacular moments. Sometimes, there are so many abandoned tanks that destroying them can take an entire working day, from early morning until late evening, leaving Russians with no chance of advancing. Let's give a thumbs up to the Ukrainian drone operators. They certainly deserve it. These guys handle aerial reconnaissance, providing target information for the HIMARS launcher team. They have suitable drones and all the necessary equipment for the job. Their goal is to identify enemy military vehicles and relay the coordinates to the HIMARS crew. This reconnaissance drone can soar high into the sky and hover above the clouds. Its optics allow it to spot targets within a 10-kilometer radius. The first target is quickly found. It's the Russian state-of-the-art 1K-148 electronic warfare station. This machine is used for enemy artillery reconnaissance, and its cost can exceed $200 million. However, just one HIMARS missile destroys this valuable Russian weapon. Among the pines, the Russians hit a Grad BM-21 along with ammunition. The HIMARS missile turns the target into a fiery storm. Unfortunately, we only regret the innocent trees. Next, aerial reconnaissance spotted the 2S4 self-propelled mortar in a truck with ammunition. Just one HIMARS missile renders them no longer usable. Two self-propelled howitzers, Nona, were also destroyed by one HIMARS missile. Russian anti-aircraft missile system, Strela-10. The Buk anti-aircraft missile system. Mobile command post on wheeled chassis. Field warehouse with ammunition. Near Avdiivka, the Russians are also losing a significant amount of armored vehicles. After a failed attack, Ukrainians burn all abandoned tanks and APCs. It's important to do this so that the Russians cannot evacuate this armor for repairs. The tanks that manage to enter the populated area are also destroyed. The equipment must be burned to ensure the enemy can no longer use it. Out of helplessness and anger, Russians resort to dropping incendiary phosphorus munitions. Russians launch new senseless attacks, hoping to capture at least one more village for their dictator, Putin. Putin has equipped them with tanks and ammunition, but hasn't provided them with intelligence. Look at this group of APCs. None of them managed to reach the village. They were all burned by Ukrainian drones. Any advancement comes at too high a cost for the Russians. They must regret their invasion of Ukraine every day. But the Russians continue to attack the village of Robotyno from different directions. Take a look at this footage. A tank and an APC are advancing towards the village, but Ukrainian FPV drones are one step ahead. First, the APC was stopped by 2 strikes, and then the drone targeted the tank. Another drone dropped a grenade on the immobilized tank, causing it to catch fire. From the same direction, the Russians intended to use the Solntsepek MLRS.
a rocket-propelled flamethrower artillery system. But the Ukrainian FPV drone destroyed it along with its ammunition load. Let's give a big thumbs up for the skillful work of the Ukrainian drone operator. Take a look at another Russian attack. This time, the leading APC hit a mine. The second APC was subsequently abandoned and destroyed by a Ukrainian FPV drone. Watch how the main parts of the armored vehicle fly off. This attack failed. Take a look at another Russian attack. This tank is trying to break through under the strikes of Ukrainian artillery. At some point, one of the shells hits the tank. After a while, the Russians sent a second tank to attack the same position. The tank managed to make several shots, but then was hit by a Ukrainian FPV drone. Then 2 more drones finished off the tank. At this location, the Russians lost several tanks over the course of several days. This Russian T-80 tank received several hits from drones, but in the end, it was left without a turret. Nearby, another abandoned Russian APC was found. With the help of a single drone armed with a shaped charge warhead, it was ignited from the inside, resulting in a spectacular fire. The next day, another tank was set on fire, followed by the destruction of another APC. Aren't these wonderful results achieved by Ukrainian soldiers? Watch how skillfully the Ukrainian FPV drone, resembling a bee, selects its target for the strike. It managed to ignite the new Russian APC on the first attempt. Similar scenes are unfolding on other parts of the front line. For every kilometer they advance, the Russians lose hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles as well as thousands of soldiers. Losing equipment at such a rate, Russians will need at least 50 years to win this war. In 2 years of full-scale warfare, they haven't achieved a single one of their goals. Not a single one. Another interesting fact: when Russian soldiers abandon their armored vehicles, they usually seek shelter from Ukrainian FPV drones. This could be trenches or partially destroyed buildings. However, Ukrainian defenders have devised special ammunition with an incendiary mixture. Attacking Russians with such weapons literally sends them into hell. And all of this is to make Russians regret their invasion of Ukraine every single day. Also, what's even more important, Ukrainian forces are striking Russian territory daily. Here's another example of how a massive tank attack was repelled solely by FPV drones. In January of this year, the Russians attacked Avdiivka from different directions. The Russians deployed dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, but the Ukrainians were prepared for this attack and had stocked up on a sufficient number of FPV drones. To repel a large-scale attack, it's crucial to have various combinations of mini drones, but most importantly, to have at least a few drones equipped with shaped charge warheads. This is necessary to explode at least a few tanks and intimidate the Russians. Then they are more likely to abandon their armored vehicles and flee. The sight of a blown-up tank on the battlefield really sends shivers down the spine. So the Russians abandon their tanks and flee, unwilling to be caught in a burning tank. In that case, Ukrainians can save on FPV drones. After all, abandoned tanks can be set on fire in a simpler way, by tossing a grenade into the hatch, and that is usually sufficient. So, when the Russians attack, the main goal is to blow up one or several of their tanks. Then, they start to panic and scatter, abandoning their armored vehicles on the battlefield. After that, this armor can be destroyed using cheaper FPV drones or by throwing grenades. The drones hover over the battlefield like wasps and destroy one tank after another until they burn them all down. This is what modern warfare looks like. Later, Ukrainians found 2 more brand new Russian tanks abandoned by the Russians out of fear. A drone ignited one of the tanks, causing it to burn like a torch, so that the Russians could see from a distance that their attack had failed. Here's another example of how a drone equipped with a regular grenade can outmatch a tank. This Russian tank attacked a Ukrainian bunker and received a drone strike directly into the tank's engine compartment. As a result, the tank became immobilized. The Russians fired 2 more shots, after which they had to abandon the tank and flee. Of course, later, the Ukrainians set fire to the abandoned tank. And finally, I want to show you another Russian attack that was thwarted solely by drones. This took place near Avdiivka in January of this year. The Russians behaved strangely and disorganized right from the start of the attack. They themselves damaged one of their tanks without an obvious reason. But when they entered the gray zone and began to approach the Ukrainian positions, a swarm of Ukrainian drones simply started destroying them one by one. The Ukrainians managed to reach and strike with a drone even the tank that the Russians had damaged before the battle. About half an hour later, all the Russian tanks were knocked out and ablaze. The battlefield was shrouded in smoke.
But let's get back to shape charge projectiles. Interestingly, the Ukrainian algorithm works not only against Russian tanks, but also against any Russian armored vehicles. Take a look. The Russian APC-3 is carrying out a combat mission, attacking, firing at Ukrainian trenches, probably loaded with ammunition. But the Ukrainian FPV drone sneaked up from behind and hits it right in the turret. The APC exploded along with the ammunition. The shape charge projectile easily penetrates the armor of any Russian armored vehicle. And this is the Russian self-propelled Howitzer 2S-19. The FPV drone with a shape charge projectile hits the howitzer from the front. The strike causes an instantaneous detonation of the ammunition. The drone easily penetrates the armor of the howitzer. Even if an immediate explosion doesn't occur, it will happen minutes later. Whether it's a howitzer or a tank. Or even an abandoned but loaded with ammunition known a howitzer. But my favorite is the destruction of the Russian multiple launch rocket system, Solntsepek, which uses reactive thermobaric missiles. Look, this video was shot last summer. Solntsepek is on a combat mission. The installation is fully loaded with 24 rockets, the Ukrainian FPV drone hits it directly in the ignition mechanism. As a result of the hit, all the rockets exploded. And this case is even more impressive. Ukrainian intelligence found the Russian Solntsepak preparing to launch rockets. It was decided to use an FPV drone with a shaped charge projectile. The drone strike caused an immediate detonation of the entire ammunition of the enemy installation, turning it into a large fireball. This Solntsepak is also heading to a firing position for rocket launches. But a Ukrainian drone is hunting it, and as we see, the drone is armed with a suitable projectile. The result of the hit turned out to be very impressive. And this specimen was hit right during the rocket launch. In the same way, you can destroy the Grad MLRS. In this video, we see the Russian Grad BM-21 launches several rockets and then move to the next firing position. But on its way, it is intercepted by a Ukrainian drone. Upon impact, the remaining ammunition in the installation detonates. Using a combination of an FPV drone and a shaped charge projectile, Ukrainians have destroyed hundreds of Russian tanks and numerous other valuable military vehicles. When Ukrainians attached a shaped charge projectile from an RPG-7 to a drone, it became a real breakthrough in military tactics. This 2.5 kilogram projectile can penetrate armor up to 50 millimeters thick, meaning any Russian tank. Its use almost always results in the instant destruction of the tank and the removal of its turret. Now observe how the method of waging war has evolved over the past 2 years. At the beginning of the war, we all thought that the most critical weapon to repel Russian tanks was the Javelin anti-tank system. Now, we see how Ukrainian soldiers managed to stop any Russian tank with just FPV drones. A bit later, it was considered that artillery was the most crucial weapon in the confrontation between the two armies. But now, we begin to understand that FPV drones even have an advantage over artillery. Drones move faster than tanks, maneuver excellently, and hit targets with high precision. You can hide from artillery shells in a trench or bunker, while hiding from an FPV drone is impossible anywhere. Like these, they can fly into even the smallest openings and destroy the enemy's live forces. Moreover, any FPV drone with explosives will not exceed the cost of $1,000, while any Western projectile costs more than $50,000, and the Javelin ATGM cost over $80,000. Mentioning the high maneuverability of FPV drones, note how skillfully they fly into Russian armored vehicles and detonate them. Artillery is incapable of such actions. Understanding how the rules of warfare had changed, both Ukrainians and Russians have ramped up the mass production of these FPV drones. Even if Ukraine stops receiving artillery ammunition and javelins, it can continue repelling Russian attacks for a long time, solely with the help of drones. Watch this video. An FPV drone narrowly missed hitting a Russian Su-25 fighter jet. The aircraft managed to evade the drone at the last moment. Here, we see how a Ukrainian FPV drone narrowly avoided colliding with the Russian Ka-52 helicopter. There's no doubt that in the near future, Ukrainians will be downing Russian frontline aviation with drones. Russian aviation has to fly at low altitudes to avoid being targeted by air defense systems, but flying low makes them vulnerable to Ukrainian FPV drones. Russians filmed on the same road where the column of their armored vehicles was destroyed, and we can see the losses they suffered. Russian tanks always burn well. This Russian T-80 tank was hit by a Ukrainian FPV drone. Upon impact, it exploded into small pieces. On the way to Avdiivka, the Russians are losing a lot of their equipment even before reaching the battlefield. The road is strewn with destroyed tanks and APCs. making it practically impossible to pass unnoticed. This Russian APC is no exception. For those who manage to get past this road, defeat awaits on the battlefield, as happens to this armored vehicle. It was hit by an FPV drone and later exploded. 2 more Russian APCs with infantry were on a mission. The first armored vehicle was hit by a Javelin missile, while the crew of the second APC was figuring out what to do. The Ukrainians struck them with an FPV drone. Another Russian APC was hit and didn't make it to the battlefield. Ukrainian soldiers have learned to use the Bradley very effectively in counterattacks, but more and more often, they refuse to use tanks of Russian origin, and here's why. Watch this video. During a counterattack, a Ukrainian T-72 tank, which is a tank of Russian origin, is blown up on a Russian mine along with ammunition. You can understand for yourself what happened to the crew of this tank. Western tanks like Leopard, Challenger, or Abrams may not be perfect and also have vulnerabilities, but at least they guarantee the lives of their crews. Look at how skillfully Ukrainian soldiers using Javelin missiles destroyed an advancing column of Russian armored vehicles. 3 out of 4 APCs were hit. All infantry attacks were repelled, so Russians began using artillery, particularly the BM-21 Grad. Look! This is a Russian Su-25 aircraft, and this is a Russian Grad multiple rocket launcher firing Russian rockets. There are only a few meters between the fighter and the missile. If the plane had flown a fraction of a second faster, it would have been shot down. The Russian Grad MLRS launches a rocket strike against Ukrainian targets, but was destroyed by a HIMARS missile. Take a look at how it looks from distance. The explosion was so powerful that nothing remained of the Russian MLRS except for a crater in the ground. This is archival footage from September of last year. It shows another BM-21 Grad MLRS explosion along with its ammunition. Ukrainian reconnaissance found a large depot with rocket ammunition. With the help of an FPV drone, the depot was hit and exploded a few minutes later. Reconnaissance also discovered a pile of Russian anti-tank mines. It remains a mystery why the Russians leave their mines exposed, scattered on the ground and without cover. But this doesn't stop Ukrainian drones from turning Russian mines into a fiery inferno. Numerous discovered Russian mines also take off into the air. The American MLRS HIMARS continues to work successfully on the front lines, destroying many Russian artillery systems daily. In collaboration with reconnaissance, the self-propelled howitzer 2S5 was destroyed. And here's a highly valuable Russian weapon, the Buk surface-to-air missile system. Just one HIMARS missile turns it into a New Year's fireworks show. Having such a moment, I congratulate you to the arrival of 2024. This is the Russian OSA anti-aircraft missile system. The Russians barely had time to hide between the trees before being hit by a HIMARS missile. Here, the Russians concealed the self-propelled howitzer 2S-19. But is it possible to hide from Ukrainian reconnaissance? Of course not. The howitzer was also hit by a HIMARS missile, destroyed by fire. At night, Russians dared to use the TOS-1 Buratino MLRS, which fires thermobaric projectiles. This weapon has a range of only 6 kilometers. Russians need to get as close as possible to Ukrainian positions, but reconnaissance detected the MLRS, and with the help of a HIMARS missile, the target was destroyed. This is what the destruction of TOS-1 Buratino looks like during the day. And like this. Another TOS-1 Buratino was also destroyed at night. FPV drones have practically replaced 122mm and 155mm artillery. That's why they are so important, and their production needs to be increased. Unlike conventional artillery, drones have incredible maneuverability and precision. In this example, see how it works. Ukrainians tried to hit a Russian tank with conventional artillery shells, but they fall short without damaging the tank. However, a few seconds later, the tank was hit by an FPV drone, forcing the Russians to abandon the tank and hide among the trees.
In today's episode, you will see new videos of how Ukrainians repel waves of Russian attacks. You will witness dozens of destroyed and burning tanks and armored vehicles. Perhaps the Russians have never faced such fierce resistance as they did last week. So let's begin. But let's start with the new Russian attack on one of the Ukrainian villages near Avdiivka. Russians are once again attempting to surround the settlement from different directions by sending tanks and APCs. Ukrainian soldiers greet them with cluster munitions. More ammunition has been arriving at the front, so the Russians have no chance. Cluster munitions easily damage Russian APCs and prevent the crews from escaping. Ukrainian drones flying over the battlefield immediately drop grenades on them to completely destroy the vehicles. Abandoned on the battlefield, the Russian tank becomes a tempting prize for Ukrainian drone operators. It would be great to take this tank, but in the current circumstances, it's almost impossible. So it has to be destroyed instead. However, one can still enjoy the spectacle. We all know that Russian tanks are the best in the world when it comes to burning in flames. You'll be surprised, but Ukrainian soldiers compete among themselves for the best grenade throw into the hatch of Russian tanks. It's like a 3-point field goal in basketball. Moreover, the reward for hitting the target accurately is a burning Russian tank. What could be better for a soldier defending his country? Ukrainian soldiers have reached such a level of skill that they can even blow smoke rings out of the turret hatch of Russian tanks. This has never been seen in the world history of wars. The guys definitely deserve a like from you, but let's go back to the battlefield. Encountering the first resistance, the Russians start to panic. They rapidly lose their organization and cohesion. Some begin to turn their armored vehicles to flee. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians use all available means against the enemy. Anti-tank weapons have not lost their relevance even with the advent of kamikaze drones. Eventually, the Russians abandon their armored vehicles and flee. Those who manage to escape by transport rather than on foot are considered luckier, like these guys. But eventually, even they got stuck in the trench. The smartest ones decide not to run anywhere but to build fortifications using their damaged armored vehicles to protect themselves from drones. Some even dig trenches like this guy. He knows that sooner or later Ukrainian FPV towers. But the Russians continue to advance on other fronts as well. Here, they encounter fierce resistance from Ukrainian artillery. On the southern front, the Russians have switched to the offensive. They are launching attacks with groups of several tanks from different directions. As usual, a tank with a mine-clearing system is leading the way. A Ukrainian drone stops this tank by dropping several small grenades. Armored vehicles. The thing is, Russians often try to evacuate damaged armored vehicles to repair them. But Ukrainians cannot allow this. Everything must be destroyed, like this Russian T-80 tank, which was burned with just one grenade. Ukrainian forces are equipped with an ample number of drones today and are ready to repel any Russian attack, which they are successfully doing. As of now, almost 90% of Russian armored vehicles are being destroyed thanks to FPV drones. This tank turned out to be the most unlucky today. The next day, the Ukrainians continued to repel Russian tank attacks and, from the early morning, destroyed a T-90 tank. This tank exploded like a fireball. However, the next tank proved to be a tough nut to crack. The Ukrainians launched over 6 kamikaze drones at it, but they didn't get any result. They couldn't even ignite the tank. But then, they used a powerful shaped charge shell. This led to an immediate explosion of the tank. Look, all that's left of the Russian tank is a crater and scattered parts around it. With each new attack, the Russians hope for success. They deploy hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles into battle, but can barely advance 100 meters. After another failed attack on the city of Avdiivka, the Russians abandoned their armored vehicles and scattered. Ukrainian defenders are now ready to set enemy tanks and APCs on fire. And as practice shows, Russian equipment burns quite well. We have increasingly noticed that Russian soldiers don't even try to preserve their armored vehicles. They fear being inside and immediately abandon them at the slightest danger. Sometimes we are asked, why Ukrainian soldiers destroy the abandoned Russian armored vehicles? Why they don't take them for themselves? The answer is simple. Russian armored vehicles have no value when it comes to preserving soldiers' lives. That's why the Russians themselves abandon them at the first opportunity, and Ukrainians burn them and refuse to use them. Nothing burns and explodes as well as Russian armored vehicles. The Ukrainian army has entire units of FPV drone operators. They are always the first to repel Russian tank attacks. The main goal is to separate the tanks from their crews. When the crews abandon the tanks, then other operators engage in their destruction. This is another abandoned group consisting of 1 tank and 2 APCs on the battlefield. Notice how skillfully the operator guides the FPV drone directly into the tank's hatch. After that, the tank caught fire. A burning Russian tank on the battlefield holds significant symbolic value. When the Russians see their tanks burning and exploding ahead, their morale drops, and they usually advance without much enthusiasm, knowing they could be next. After this tank, the Ukrainians also destroyed the 2 APCs following it.
2 more Russian armored vehicles were on a mission. The first one exploded on a mine and was hit by a drone.
The second one was simply abandoned in the middle of the road by a frightening crew. Then the Ukrainian FPV drone set it on fire. Engulfed in flames, the Russian armored personnel carrier burned brightly for a long time. This Russian APC was supposed to transport soldiers to the front line, but was blown up on a mine along with its ammunition. Another APC was following it and also exploded on a mine. Then all the ammunition inside detonated. A sad fate awaits the Russians. These two Russian tanks were supposed to attack from a different direction, but the first tank exploded on a mine. The second tank felt the merciless strike of a Ukrainian drone. The attack failed. Another tank was hit by an FPV drone and caught fire. It's amazing how a few drones can halt any Russian invasion. Russians lost a lot of armored vehicles around the town of Krenki, but still couldn't reach their goal. Within the town limits, Russian tanks have no chance of avoiding defeat from ubiquitous Ukrainian drones. After infiltrating the town, the Russians set up a bunker in an abandoned house, but a HIMARS missile turns them into powder. Another house with Russians inside also turns into dust. And one more time. Krenki has already become a new graveyard for Russian tanks. In their attempt to eliminate the Ukrainian foothold, the Russians are losing more than expected. It's a big question. Can the Russian industry replenish such losses? This Ukrainian soldier shared a story of how he alone managed to thwart a Russian attack. After aerial reconnaissance spotted the advance of Russian armored vehicles, he used a Javelin missile to destroy one APC and one tank. The crew of the leading tank fled. Then, Russians continued with 4 more APCs. The soldier disabled one of them with a Javelin missile. The remaining APCs on the battlefield were burned using grenade-dropping methods. A tank battle occurred on the border between Russia and Ukraine. A pro-Ukrainian Russian group conducted a tank attack on the border checkpoint. Using several tanks, they invaded Russian territory and targeted fire-struck Russian border guards. The Russians did not expect the attack in this location, so frightened, they abandoned the border checkpoint and fled. But in attempting to advance further, one of the tanks hit a mine. The tank crew was forced to abandon the tank and return to the rear. Meanwhile, the Russians were contemplating how to repel the attack. They also wanted to take the damaged tank as a trophy, but concluded that evacuating the tank at the moment was impossible and decided to destroy it. The Russians had no other means to destroy the tank besides a grenade, but that proved to be sufficient. While the tank was burning, the Russians attempted to repel the invasion. They deployed a Su-34 aircraft equipped with heavy glide bombs FAB-250 and began bombing the border checkpoint on their territory. Look at how the bomb wings unfold. The Russians are not afraid to drop bombs on their own territory, destroying their infrastructure, just to stop the enemy's invasion as quickly as possible. Also, take a look at how a Russian army tank is shooting at the homes of Russian citizens, destroying them completely. They seem to believe that opposition the Russians are deploying air defense assets close to the front lines. In these images, you can see how Ukrainians destroyed the Russian air defense system using a HIMARS missile. But the biggest escalation occurred the next day. Using a high-altitude drone, the Russians tracked the refueling location for Ukrainian helicopters. Initially, the Russians dropped a cluster bomb on this location to target the personnel. Then, they used precision bombs to hit 2 helicopters, one after the other. As a result, the Ukrainians suffered heavy losses on that day. The reason for such a failure is that the helicopter refueling was conducted in the open without any camouflage. Now take a look at what's happening on the front line. The Russians are systematically conducting tank attacks on the village of Robotyno. In this video, a tank and 2 APCs are advancing, but the lead tank is destroyed by a Ukrainian mine. The APCs carefully maneuver around the tank to avoid the mines and reach the village, where they unload troops. The Russians hope to establish a foothold on the edge of the village to later expand their offensive. However, the Ukrainians deliberately lure them into the village to destroy them. The Ukrainians have turned this village into a trap, from which the Russians have no way back. All the armored vehicles that enter this village are destroyed by kamikaze drones. The tank that was previously blown up by a mine was also destroyed by an FPV drone. Russian commanders send additional armored vehicles with infantry, but the infantry scatters, and the armored vehicles are destroyed. Look at this incident. A Russian APC was hit by a mine while attempting to enter the village. Shortly after, Ukrainians sent an FPV drone to set the APC on fire. It caught fire and eventually exploded along with its ammunition. It was a very powerful explosion. In today's episode, you will see how Ukrainians repel the advance of Russian tank columns. So, let's begin. In this footage, you can see Russian forces advancing on tanks and armored vehicles towards Ukrainian positions. They intend to seize another populated area. However, Ukrainian defenders have prepared a surprise for them. The FPV drone equipped with a shaped charge warhead can detonate any Russian tank with a single strike. Take a look at this abandoned Russian T-80 tank. The drone hits it at the base of the turret and you can see the result for yourself. And the Russians know this, so they advance cautiously. Ukrainians allow them to pass through the gray zone and approach closer. Then, they simultaneously launch all prepared drones and begin to target the Russian armor, until not a single tank or APC remains intact. Thus, the Russian attack has faltered. From a technical standpoint, penetrating the Ukrainian defense is nearly impossible, but the Russians achieve some success due to their significantly larger infantry and armored vehicle numbers. Russian tank crews scatter but come under fire from cluster munitions. But even if the Russians manage to advance by 100 meters somewhere, they pay an incredibly high price for this progress. In this video, you can see another failed Russian attack near Avdiivka. They abandoned their equipment and fled. After that, the Ukrainians only had to finish the job and burn the Russian armored vehicles, which they successfully did. More than 7 tanks and APCs, totaling $12 million, were lost by the Russians in one attack. Meanwhile, Ukrainians, to repel this attack, used only FPV drones. But what looks even stranger is the scattered Russian soldiers trying to survive in an uneven competition with Ukrainian drones. The Ukrainian drone dropped a note to the Russian soldier, but he was afraid and discarded it.
After a few minutes, the Russian soldier finally unfolded the note and read it. The note said, "If you want to live, follow the drone and you will be saved." The Russian soldier agreed and followed the drone, saving his life. Guys, let's give a like to the Ukrainians for their humane attitude towards the enemy.
After capturing Avdiivka, the Russians continued to advance on some sections of the front.
In this video, a column of Russian armored vehicles attacks at night but encounters serious resistance. Ukrainian defenders destroy one tank after another. In the morning, we saw the wreckage of Russian armored vehicles. The attack failed. Over the past week, Ukrainians have managed to repel over 10 major attacks near the city of Mariinka, and after each attack, the Russians lose dozens of tanks and armored vehicles. Before your eyes are two abandoned Russian T-72 tanks. The first drone ignites one tank. While the second leads to a large explosion. Another tank attack failed. In the same location, a few days later, the Russians lost another entire column of armored vehicles. In this video, you can see how Ukrainians destroy abandoned APCs.
Ukrainian forces are doing everything to make each meter of progress too costly for the Russians.
I want to show you an interesting example of how an FPV drone helps in a crucial moment. About a month ago, the Russians attempted to capture a fortified Ukrainian position near Bakhmut. A Russian armored vehicle approached the Ukrainians closely and opened machine gun fire on them. The Russians were very close and ready to disembark to capture the Ukrainian bunker. But the Ukrainians launched a drone from the bunker and hit the Russian APC from behind. Inside the APC were at least 7 Russian assault troops. That's how just one drone stopped the Russians and saved the Ukrainian location. But that's not all. Not far from there was another Russian tank that was supposed to provide support. Seeing that the attack failed, the tank began to retreat, but it was caught up by the Ukrainian drone. All this means that 10 Russian soldiers, armed with a tank and APC, with plenty of ammunition inside, were unable to capture the Ukrainian bunker because of 2 FPV drones.
In this video, you see the Russian T-80 tank. The crew of this tank does not know that in exactly 1 minute, they will disappear forever. A Ukrainian FPV drone is hunting this tank, equipped with a special shaped charge projectile capable of penetrating the armor of any Russian tank. The hit on the tank led to the detonation of the ammunition, and the tank exploded in just 1 second. The detached tank turret lies on the ground. Mission failed. Today, I'll show you many videos like this and explain how the Ukrainian algorithm for tank destruction with FPV drones works. You'll learn how Ukrainians have permanently changed the face of modern warfare. So let's get started. First, see how FPV drones attack Russian tanks but can't cause significant damage. Sometimes, the tank can be damaged but not destroyed. Russians abandon such tanks on the battlefield, and they can be destroyed with another type of drone, dropping a grenade into the tank turret hatch. This tactic has proven effective, but it's not the best approach. Once, Ukrainians came up with something truly amazing. An algorithm that allows turning Russian tanks into flaming scrap metal with a single hit. What if you attach a shaped charge projectile from an RPG-7 to the drone? It's an anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade designed specifically for penetrating tank armor. And what if you direct this projectile right into the base of the Russian tank's turret, into the rear area of the tank? Exactly. The tank will be immediately destroyed. Take a look at this video. It's an abandoned Russian T-72 tank near Bakhmut, and there are likely still some ammunition inside. In the video, you can see a Ukrainian FPV drone hitting the tank from behind at its most vulnerable spot, the base of the tank turret. As a result, the tank explodes and the turret detaches, soaring into the air. The tank's game over. Another incident that confirms the Ukrainian algorithm for destroying Russian tanks. This is a T-80 tank. We see the first drone hitting the tank in its front, but nothing happens. Then, the second drone strikes the base of the turret from behind, and it's the end for the Russian tank. The thing is, the shaped charge projectile penetrates the tank's armor and hits the ammunition inside, causing an immediate detonation. So in addition to defeating the tank, we also get a spectacular explosion, all thanks to the right algorithm. This Russian tank was blown up in the exact same way. A drone with a shaped charge projectile hit the tank's vulnerable spot from behind. One vivid example of this tactic was captured last summer. A Russian tank was on a mission with a full load of ammunition. A Ukrainian FPV drone armed with a shaped charge grenade hit the tank from behind at the base of the turret, resulting in an immediate detonation of all the tank's ammunition. If there are no ammunition in the tank, it won't explode, but it will burn entirely, also become useless. Note that the drone strikes the rear part of the tank turret. This is the most vulnerable spot for Russian tanks. If the drone hits from the front, as you can see in this video, the tank may survive. The Russians installed dynamic protection primarily on the front part of the tank. However, when the drone hits the tank in the rear part of the tunnel, it always catches fire. We've already seen numerous cases like these. And again, if there are ammunition in the tank, it leads to an immediate detonation and a massive explosion. Russians install electronic warfare systems on their tanks. Still, Ukrainian drones somehow overcome them. In this video, we see a drone hitting a tank equipped with an anti-drone system. From a distance, we see what happened to this tank. Perhaps it's the highest flight of a tank turret in history. It's worth mentioning another way to kill tanks. A small FPV drone armed with a single grenade can fly into the tank through the hatch in the turret. The grenade explodes and the tank burns. But if there are ammunition inside, they will definitely explode, rendering the tank useless. We are dealing with a new reality. It's amazing how a small FPV drone, which can be assembled by hand and then equipped with a regular grenade, can burn a 40-ton massive tank. Here's another such case. The drone literally fell into the turret hatch, and the tank caught fire from the grenade explosion.